So hello everyone, and welcome to my PhD defense presentation. So thank you very much for being here physically or virtually. And a special thanks to my jury members for agreeing to review my work and put a lot of time and effort into it. So the title of my work is Towards Social Autotelic Artificial Agents, Formation and Exploitation of Cultural Conventions in Autonomous Embodied Artificial Agents. So this is a very long title with a lot to unpack in it. So I'm going to first zoom on the concept of autotelic and cultural conventions. And for that, I'm going to start by looking at how humans develop. So maybe the best way to describe human learning is by considering the fact that we are goal-directed social learners. So first, we are goal-directed learners. So if we look at child development, we observe that children spend a lot of time spontaneously exploring their environment. And in this process, they are never externally told to do so. Instead, they rely on what psychologists call intrinsic motivations, but what we call in everyday language, curiosity. So from very early stages of their development, children invent and pursue their own problems. And as they grow older, these problems become more and more complex, and children become proficient in many different domains. And to name this kind of learning, where agents invent and target their own goals, we will use the term autotelic, which comes from the Greek auto, which means self, and telos, that means goals. Another striking component of human learning is our social nature. So we use social interaction and language every day to perform a wide diversity of tasks. So for instance, we use it to cooperate and achieve collective goals. We use it as well to teach, to think and organize our thoughts. And we also use language to transmit values, norms, or knowledge in general. So for this presentation and for my research, I decided to use a very broad definition of cultural convention as any social production that aims at doing these four things. So autotelic and social learnings are uniquely human capacities, and there is a field that aims at studying how these structures actually develop in humans. And this field is called developmental science. And in parallel to this field, there is another field which aims at using modern AI techniques to model the interactions between an agent and the world, and to observe the development of sensory motor, cognitive, and socio-cultural interaction. And this field is called Developmental AI. So now that we have defined the autotelic and cultural convention terms, and we have defined the domain in which we are doing our studies, let me focus on the terms formation and exploitation. And what it basically means is that my research can be split into two parts that I will both discuss today. So in the first part, we will follow a bottom-up approach and investigate how cultural convention can actually emerge between artificial agents. Then we will switch to the second part where we will follow a top-down approach this time and investigate how those cultural conventions can actually help agents learn and help them learn in this autotelic fashion that we described. So what's important to note is that these two parts of my research rely on very different assumptions. So in the first part, we will consider interaction between two artificial agents, two learning agents, and therefore we will consider their interaction as a multi-agent distributed system. And when agents will exchange information, exchange messages, we will assume no pre-existing meaning, which basically means that the goal of the agent is actually to develop the cultural convention, to give a meaning to those messages that they will exchange. Whereas in the second part, we will consider interactions between a single learning agent and simulated human behaviors. So because we use human behaviors there, this comes with meaning associated to the messages and the information that it is going to provide. So the aim of this second part is not to develop the cultural convention, but rather to exploit it and see how it can help agents become better learners, help them form abstraction, as we saw this morning, help them generalize, and help them become more creative. So now that you know basically everything about the content of this presentation, let me show you how I decided to organize it. So without any surprise, we will start with the first part, formation of cultural convention. So we will go through some background work on computational models of language formation that will allow us to propose two computational studies, so the architect builder problem and the graphical referential game. Then we will move on to the second part. I will actually explain how artificial agents can become autotelic, how they can invent and pursue their own problems. Then I will present the Vygotskian Autotelic AI framework that builds on this autotelic principle, but extends these principles to actually consider social cultural interactions. And then finally, we will end up this presentation with the presentation of the Imagine algorithm, which is actually a concrete implementation of a Vygotskian Autotelic agent. So without further ado, let's start with the first part, so formation of cultural convention. As I just said, I will start with models of language formation in computational science. So the framework usually considers a population of agents, and this population is open, meaning that new agents will come to the population and others will leave. All the agents have internal states that represent their knowledge about the world, but also their knowledge about social interactions. And these agents can engage in two types of interactions. So they can form the newcomers to the population by genetic interactions, but they can also exchange messages, during linguistic interactions so as to modify their internal states. This is really abstract for now, but what's important to note is that this framework actually led to significant and concrete results, such as the talking head experiment proposed by Steele in 2002, where two robots starting from arbitrary representation actually managed to agree on a shared vocabulary to name objects. It also led to the iterated learning framework that allows agents to refine and develop a language over several generations. And for the scope of my research, I will mainly focus on linguistic interactions between two learning agents. And more specifically, my contributions will build on the language game framework. So in a language game, we have two agents, a speaker and a listener, that both observe a context made up of several objects, several referents. The speaker is given a target referent, here the yellow star, and is expected to produce an iterance in order to name it. And on his side, the listener is going to observe this iterance and choose the object that is being referred to. And if the chosen object and the target object don't match, then the game is a failure, but if they match, it's a success. So early implementation of language games relied on tabular representation. So basically, tables that score the associations between iterances and referents. So in the small example that I give here, actually the representation of the agents are not aligned, which means that the game is going to be a failure. So a simple way to actually align the representation of the agent is by performing contrastive updates, so diminishing the score between unsuccessful association and reinforcing the score of successful one. Yeah, I forgot to mention this is an iterative process. Then this framework was extended to more complex visual objects using neural network agents. And for that, we couldn't rely on contrastive updates. Instead, we had to use reinforcement learning to basically backpropagate the result of the language game into the weight of the network. So this is done by giving low rewards to unsuccessful association and high rewards to successful ones. The idea of using rewards and reinforcement learning to actually model the emergence of communication was then taken to a further step with multi-agent reinforcement learning communication. And this allowed, for instance, to study multi-step and bidirectional forms of communication and emergence of communication in more complex scenarios. So the two computational studies that I'm going to present now actually rely on the recent approaches I just presented. And more specifically, they are going to aim at addressing some of their limitations. So for instance, our first experimental study will look at this multi-agent reinforcement learning communication setup, and more specifically look at the rewards that all the agents are perceiving. And the fact that all the agents are perceiving a reward while they are trying to negotiate a communication protocol is actually a strong assumption, because it means that all the agents have information about the task. So this means that they have a lot of common ground. So in this first study, we were going actually to relax this assumption and investigate a setup where only one agent perceives the reward. And this will be in the presentation of the architect-builder problem. Our second experimental study will basically investigate the emergence of communication using more realistic channels of communication. But we will come to that later on. We'll do that with the graphical referential game. So now let's go over our first computational study, the architect-builder problem. So this is a project that I carried out in 2022 with Paul Bart from Milan. So I'm going to start here with some motivations about humans again. So humans are really good at teaching and learning from each other. And what's impressive with that is that they can also do so in contexts where there is really little common ground and sometimes when there is no shared language. And there is a field that investigates how these forms of communication can emerge between humans by performing really experiments in the laboratory with humans. And this field is called experimental semiotics. And an example of how humans are actually able to develop communication protocols in contexts where there is no shared information is the Coco game experiment proposed by Vollmer and colleagues in 2014. So in the Coco game experiment, there are two human participants that are each located in separated rooms. So the architect is given a picture of a construction target, and the builder in the other room is seated in front of the Lego blocks, and is actually to reconstruct the structure. But the builder has no idea about the shape of the structure. He can only perceive messages that are sent by an architect. Because it is observing its behavior, it can actually try and guide the builder with those abstract signs that it is set. And the question that we asked in this first study is, what happens if the two agents are actually artificial agents? So to conduct this study, we actually translated the Coco game into a sequential decision-making problem, where we find the same assumption as in the Coco game. So basically, because only the architect knows about the target structure, only the architect is going to perceive the information about the task. So only the architect is going to perceive the reward function, the reward, sorry. The architect cannot take any action in the environment. It can only send messages to the builder. And then from these messages, the builder can actually perform actions in the environment. And for our experiments, we use a build world environment, which is basically a grid world with some building blocks that the agent can move around, so the builder can move around. So now let's go over our solution to this problem, which is named ABIG for Architect Builder Iterative Guiding. So our approach relies on two high-level priors, which are the interaction frames prior, which we'll basically use to make sure that agents learn in stationary environments. And the other prior that we use is the shared intent prior, which will be used to recover a learning signal for the builder in absence of any reward. So let's go over the actual development of this algorithm. So learning is separated into two frames. So in the first frame, the modeling frame, the architect is going to collect data about the builder and construct a model of the builder. Then the agent will switch to a second frame, the guiding frame, and the architect will use the model of the builder to actually guide it towards the goal. So the fact that we are actually separating learning between two phases is the illustration of the first prior that we used, interaction frame. So in the first frame, the builder will be frozen, it will not be learning, and only the architect will be learning. And in the second frame is the opposite. The architect's module will be frozen, and only the builder will learn. So to collect data about the builder, the architect is basically just going to send random messages and observe its behavior. And then it's going to store all the transition in the data set and perform behavioral cloning and learn the model of the builder, so the policy of the builder. Once it has this model of the builder, it can basically just perform planning. So leveraging the model of the builder to actually search the messages that will yield promising action by the builder and actually guide him toward the goal. But now we need to learn the policy of the builder. The builder needs actually to react to those messages. And this is when we actually use the shared intent prior. And what we assume is that because architect and builder are optimizing for the same objectives, the guiding data that was just collected can be actually considered as expert demonstration of the task to be performed. And therefore, by simply performing behavioral cloning on the guiding data, the builder can actually hope to solve the task. And once this is done, we switch to the modeling frame again and iterate again. So to evaluate the performances of this approach, we proposed 4 training tasks. So the first one being the grasp, where the builder needs to actually just grasp a block in the grid world. Then there is the place task, where it actually needs to take a block and place it at a specific location. And finally, the H and V line task, where the builder needs to build either a horizontal or vertical line. And for later on, we will use testing shapes that look like the one that is being constructed right now, which is a T shape. So we actually trained the agent on this task using our A-big algorithm that I just described. And during learning, we monitored some mutual information metrics. So we actually measured the mutual information between messages and actions and states and actions. So we wanted to know what is driving the policy of the builder. And what we observed is that during learning, at some point where the agents actually start to succeed at a certain task, the actions of the builder become more and more driven by the messages given by the architect, which is a proof of emergence of communication. We wanted to know how a dyad of agents trained on a certain task actually generalize to other tasks. So we actually performed this test, and here I want to draw your attention to this specific place task. So what we observed is that when we train a dyad on the place task, they are actually able to perform all the other tasks. So this means that if a dyad of agents successfully negotiate a communication protocol on a certain task, the place task here, they can then exploit this protocol and basically solve all other tasks. And this is something that we looked into, and we were able to see that agents trained on the simple place task could exploit the protocol that they learned and actually construct any shape in our build world environment. So some quick conclusion about this first study. So first, interaction frames and shared intents are relevant priors to model the emergence of go-directed communication in the setup that we just presented. And this is encouraging also. This is an encouraging setup because it means that artificial agents, thanks to our method, are actually able to learn a task in this context where there is very little common ground and where one agent needs to simultaneously figure out the meaning of the feedback that is being provided, but also the purpose of this feedback, the task at hand. So now let's move on to the second computational study in this first part, the graphical referential game. So this was a project that I carried out with Johan Lemel very recently. And here again, I'm going to start with motivations about humans. And I'm going to look at human communication. So if we observe human communication, we can observe that human communication always relies on continuous signals being perceived by the listener. So they produce articulations, either vocals or gestural, and this results in sensory effects, so either audio or visual, that are perceived by the listener. And in the study that I just presented to you, and in all the other approaches, the communication between the agents always rely on discrete symbols that are basically one-hot vectors. And this is something that is therefore not realistic. So in this project, we wanted to know what happens if actually communication is more ecological and actually relies on a sensory motor system. And so we proposed a graphical language game for this purpose. And this time, the discrete signal that was used before is replaced by a graphical iterance that is produced by a sensory motor system. So this sensory motor system is taking a continuous command vector that is fed to dynamic motion primitives in order to form a trajectory mimicking the way a robot will draw on a sheet, for instance. And then we use a sketching library to convert the trajectory into an image. And for our visual reference, so the objects that the agents are going to try and to name, we use a NIST digit placed on a 4x4 grid. And for testing purposes, we'll see later on that we will also look at how agents can generalize to compositional reference. So for that, we will use a composition of the training data, so basically 2 NIST digits in the 4x4 grid. So the solution that we propose to this problem is called curves for contrastive iterance referent associative scoring. And for this algorithm, I will not go into all the details as I just did before because it will take too much time. But the basic intuition behind curves is to actually learn an energy landscape that will represent the association between graphical iterances and visual reference. So this is a method that is inspired by the clip architecture that some of you may know. It allows us to basically generalize the concept of contrastive update that I introduced earlier to the continuous case. So if we come back to the actual discrete representation, the tabular representation, we had this representation. And what we can actually do is fit an energy on this discrete data. And then if we use encoders for the visual objects and for the graphical iterances, we can actually map these items into the same latent space and easily compute distance between them, and therefore learn the energy landscape that will basically tell us the associative score between any referent and any graphical iterant. So how well is this method actually performing? So first, we saw that if we use curves, we actually reach a success in the graphical referential game. So this means that the agents are able to name any NIST digit that is belonging to the NIST dataset. And then we looked at generalization performance. So how well do agents trained on one NIST digit are actually able to name 2 NIST digits? And for that, we saw that performances were not that great. We reached a success rate of 0.4, which is not perfect, but still the success rate is higher than a strategy where the speaker would actually name only one object in the scene, which means that in some cases, the agents actually do manage to speak about compositional reference. So more than performances, we were then curious about the structure of the emerging signs. And then we could see that the emerging lexicon were basically showing 2 features. They were coherent, meaning that 2 agents were using actually the same sign to name the same referent. But they were also non-ambiguous, meaning that they used distinct signs to name the distinct object. Because we saw encouraging generalization performances, we wanted to know if this good performance is actually reflected in a compositional structure in the emerging lexicon. And unfortunately, we couldn't extract clear compositional pattern into the emerging lexicon. So that's basically it for the first part. So we developed 2 key ideas. So the ideas of learning to communicate with little common ground, so less than other approaches. And we also looked into a way of modeling more ecological forms of communication. So now I'm going to switch to the second part, where agents are actually going to exploit cultural convention to become better learners. So in the introduction, I defined the autotelic term, and if you remembered, it's a way to name learners that actually invent and pursue their own problems. And in this second part, I'm going to start by actually explaining how artificial agents can become autotelic. And for that, we have to come back to reinforcement learning. So in standard reinforcement learning, an agent learns to interact with the world by learning a policy, which will basically map states to actions. And this policy is expected to maximize some notion of cumulative rewards. And those rewards are actually related to a goal, which is an expected behavior of the agent. But this means that the experimenter is always giving the goal to the agent. And this is something that we don't want if we want to have autotelic agents, because we want them to internalize this concept of goals and rewards. So we are going to remove the experimenter from the framework, because this is essentially what autotelic means. So concretely, how does autotelic learning work? So autotelic agents have three main modules: a goal generator that decides which goal to pursue, then a reward function that informs when the goal is reached, and finally a goal condition policy that will produce the sequences of actions in order to fulfill that goal. So autotelic learning unfolds in four steps. So first, the agent is going to sample a goal from a context. Then it's actually going to try and pursue that goal using its goal condition policy. But the agent is not perfect, meaning that sometimes it's going to fail at reaching the goal, and sometimes it succeeds. But the agent actually needs to know how well it performed, and for that it's going to use its internal goal reward function to actually compute scores about the goals he was trying to achieve. And depending on these scores and the trajectories he collected, he can actually update these internal modules and try and achieve more and more goals this way. So autotelic learning has been proven to be successful at implementing agents that learn different skills in different domains. So this is, for instance, the example of the curious algorithm developed by Clément and colleagues that allow a robot to manipulate blocks in the fetch environment and to construct different structures. It was also the case of the GoalGAN or Amigo approaches, which allowed agents to solve different mazes in the AntMaze suite or solve different tasks in the mini-grid environment. But a common drawback, and a quite important drawback of this autotelic system, is that the goals that they are trying to achieve actually refer to really concrete goals. So basically, often precise state in an environment. So for instance, in the fetch environment, the goal that the agent is actually trying to achieve are the exact XYZ position of the blocks. So this means that in this precise scenario, the agent cannot realize that it's actually building a tower. It cannot form abstract goals. Another drawback of autotelic agents is that when we sample goals for exploration, even if we use incentives towards novelty, the sampling of these new goals often occurs within the distribution of known effects. And ideally, we would like our agents to come up with new ideas to invent goals that are out of the distribution of what they already see. We would like these goals to be really out of distribution. And it turns out that in this process, humans use language as a creative tool. So Piaget first discovered that children use egocentric speech to narrate their ongoing activities. Then later on, Vygotsky, in fact, identified that this egocentric speech was more an internalization of social speech that children use for exploration. And indeed, language is compositional by nature, meaning that with it, we can push the boundaries of what we already experienced toward a very novel construct. And I think that the famous sentence by Noam Chomsky, "Colorless green ideas live furiously," is a very good example of that. So what's amazing with language is that if I know two concepts, such as a cat and a bus, I can easily combine them into my mind in order to form a new concept, a cat bus. And what's even more impressive is that I can easily picture it in my mind, actually what it would look like, even though cat buses don't exist. And in fact, language plays an important role in our cognition. So many psychologists and philosophers have tried now for a long time to identify the precise role of language in our development. Unfortunately, we don't have precise answer to these questions, but I'm going to quickly expose a few ideas here because they will be important for later. So first, Brunner mentioned that when children enter the world, they are the first participants in society, and that culture shapes their cognition, basically telling us that culture influences the way we target goals, but also the way we represent goals in general. Later, Clark and Dennett mentioned that exposition to language help us form new representation that facilitates learning and help us tackle new problems. Some philosophers like Caruthers even argue that language could be the support of our thoughts, so enabling us to connect our different cognitive modules. And finally, here again we have Vygotsky, which mentioned that social interactions can be actually internalized to help us reason about the world. So I've been talking a lot about philosopher right now. So you might wonder what's the link with our autotelic agents. And what I want to draw your attention to is that if we actually expand the world of autotelic agents to socio-cultural interactions, we can expect them to become better learners, like humans. And this is actually an idea that we developed in a recent conceptual contribution with Cédric Collard. So the idea is really for the agents to actually leverage socio-cultural interaction in order to transform their cognitive tool and their internal modules. So how does this transformation can occur? So mainly through the learning of two types of modules. So extractive modules that take language as input, that will actually enable to distill language abstractions and language structure, language properties inside the modules of the agents, inside their neural networks, for instance, to help us become more capable of informing abstractions or composition. So this is something that is reminiscent with Clark's view on language, that it can actually reshape computational space. The other types of modules that these agents should learn are predictive modules that this time do not take language as input, but then output language. And the idea here is to basically leverage language and bounded productivity to help agents become more creative. And these kind of productive modules can be actually viewed as internal social interaction that Vygotsky described. So they can be viewed as virtual social partners that are inside the head of the agents and that can be triggered at any time when they actually need help to solve new tasks. So this is basically for this conceptual contribution, and now I'm going to switch to my last computational study that presents the Imagine agent that actually implements extractive and productive modules inside the reinforcement learning agent. So again, I'm going to come back to the autotelic learning loop, where agents, so the Imagine agent, is an autotelic agent, so it is internalizing goals on the network. But Imagine is also a Vygotskian agent, meaning that it's going to interact also with the social partner, that is going to provide descriptions of its behavior. So for our experiments, we use a world which is a simplified world. We're not going to use the real world, which is called Playground. So Playground is a 2D continuous world where an agent can basically navigate around and interact with the objects. So all the scenes in Playground are procedurally generated with many different objects belonging to different categories, and these objects can vary in size and color. And an important feature of Playground is that it has a compositional dynamic. So if I bring water or food to an animal, they are going to grow. And similarly, if I bring some water to a tree, for instance, it's going to grow. So this is basically the world in which we conducted our experiments. Then we have to say a few words about how the social partner actually behaves in this environment. The social partner has mainly two roles. The first one takes place at the very beginning of an episode when the agent is actually imagining a goal. The social partner is going to make sure that this goal is achievable in the environment, so it's going to set up the scene with the corresponding object. Then the agent will try and pursue its goal. So the episode will roll out, and at the end of the episode, the social partner will make his second intervention and describe the achieved outcomes. So now let me go into the modules of the Imagine agent. So in Imagine, learning is separated in two phases. In the first one, the agent is going to interact with the social partner and actually learn how to represent goals with language. And then in the second phase, the agent is going to ignore the social partner and leverage language compositionality to imagine new goals for exploration. So if you remember, when I presented the Autotelic framework, we said that Autotelic agents need three modules. And the first one is a way to represent and generate goals. So in Imagine, we use a very simple mechanism for that, which is basically a memory buffer. So the agent is going to remember all the descriptions that are provided by the social partner. And at the very beginning of an episode, it's going actually to sample a description in this memory to form a new goal for exploration. This is something that you can see in this small diagram. An interaction that was discovered at the end of an episode can actually be the goal that is targeted later on by the agent. Then, once we have a goal generator mechanism, we need an internal reward function. And for that, here again, we are going to leverage the feedback of the social partner. We are going to construct a dataset which is made up of states and descriptions. The states are actually the states in which the description were provided. And this allows an agent to actually train a goal condition reward function, which is basically a binary classifier that predicts when a certain scene, a certain state matches with a certain description. And using this internal reward function, the agent can simply perform standard reinforcement learning to actually learn the goal condition policy that is going to reach that goal in the end. So at the end of the first phase, the agent is already pretty proficient. It knows basically all the things that were communicated by the social partner. So it knows how to navigate the world, it knows how to grasp objects, and it knows how to grow animals by bringing them some food, for instance. But some interactions remain to be discovered, and this is actually something that we purposefully designed, because if you remember, we have this second phase that is coming right after this slide, where the agent is actually going to try to imagine new goals by leveraging language compositionality. So in our experiments, during the first phase, we purposefully prohibited the social partner from saying anything which is related to growing some plants, for instance. And then when we switch to the second phase, the social partner is no longer here. And now the agent is actually look in his memory buffer and shuffle the words of the goal descriptions and use language compositionality to actually come up with new ideas. So this will allow the agents to form new goals that are out of the distribution of what was described by the social partner. And then by simply leveraging its internalized goal generator on the reward function, it's going to self-train on those goals and try and achieve it. And what we observe is that it actually works. So here in this diagram, you can see the green condition is basically the agent that is never imagining goals. And then blue and red are conditions where the agent is imagining goal, but in the blue case, it is starting early, and in the red one, it's starting halfway throughout learning. And what we observe is that when the agent is actually using the goal imagination heuristics, forming new constructs, it's actually increasing his mastery of new goals. So for instance, after this first phase, it is now able to make some plants grow by bringing them some water. What we observed as well with the Imagine agent is that it has goal imagination has also a positive effect on exploration. So the discovery of new interactions that are not necessarily related to a goal that we expected. And example of these new interactions are, for instance, the agents actually trying to grow some pieces of furniture by trying to bring them some food. to wrap this study up, we saw that Imagine is an example of a Vygotskian agent that is training both extractive and productive modules. So the reward function and the policy function in the Imagine agents are extractive modules that are conditional language. And then we have this goal generator that samples new goals that are out of the distribution of the effects, which is a predictive module. Some quick limitation about the Imagine approach. So the heuristic that we use to form new goals in the second phase are actually based on a construction grammar. And they are working because the vocabulary of the social partner is very limited. It's not really natural feedback. And this heuristic is not likely to scale to more natural language with many synonyms and etc. And also an important drawback is that the goal imagination heuristic that we use is not grounded, meaning that the agent is not observing the scene before trying to imagine a goal. It still needs in the second phase to wait for the social partner to actually set up the scene, which is a strong assumption regarding the agent's autonomy. So this was my last study, and now I'm going to just conclude with some high-level takeaways and next steps for future research. So first, high-level takeaways about cultural convention formation. So in the studies that I presented, but also in the recent approaches that I introduced, you can see that we are still looking at very preliminary forms of cultural conventions, but I'm not too worried about that. I still think that it is an important subject because they are providing huge inputs in the field of experimental semiotics to better understand how actually human communication develops. And they are also very useful for AI because when agents actually learn to communicate, they might form more powerful representation. And crucially, I believe that getting knowledge into how agents actually develop cultural conventions can be very useful if you want them to exploit those cultural conventions. Some quick high-level takeaways about cultural conventions exploitation. So this is actually a hot topic in research right now, where we can see that language is used a lot in reinforcement learning agents. So this is not, for instance, the case in hierarchical reinforcement learning, where language can be viewed as a way to abstract goals for forming hierarchies. It can be also very powerful to perform insight learning, providing captioners to the agent. And as we just saw this morning, it's very powerful to perform semantic exploration and help agents explore their work. High-level takeaway about compositionality. So compositionality is an essential property of experience. We are surrounded by compositionality. You saw it in the studies that I presented. So the world can have compositional dynamics, but also the way we describe things is compositional with attributes, colors, sizes, and etc. And what we can take away from my studies is that in the curves approach that I presented to you, we saw that exposition to a compositional object didn't necessarily yield a compositional language, but this is something that I don't really know. We still have to investigate that. But on the other hand, with the Imagine approach, we actually saw that exposition to compositional language actually help the agents better understand the composition of work. So now some perspectives. So it's been 40 minutes now that I'm talking about culture, social interactions, language, and everything, and I even mentioned ChatGPT once. So now it's the time to talk about large language models and how actually they can interact with the research I just presented. So first, large language model can really be useful to study the emergence of more complex forms of socio-cultural interactions. And this is actually something that is starting to be investigated, for instance, by Park and colleagues in the interactive simulacra paper, when they actually propose a Sims-like environment in which they use agents controlled by ChatGPT, and they observe the emergence of funny behaviors such as throwing a Valentine's Day party. And there is also this Arena ChatGPT framework, where the authors of this framework actually propose to get to know better the large language models by directly interacting with them in a language game in control environment. I think that these are promising avenues. And large language models can also interact with Vygotskian agents, with agents that exploit cultural convention, and this is actually something that is really used right now. So for instance, there is the Descartes agent proposed by Nottingham and colleagues, which will appear at ICML, where they use a large language model to actually sample goals during exploration. So they can replace the goal sampler of Vygotskian Autotelic agents. Some people in our team are working on using large language models to actually produce the actions required for the agents to fulfill a goal. And they observe that this allows us, for instance, to reach higher sample efficiency. And this work will be also presented at ICML, by the way. And then there is also another work in our team proposed by Kola and colleagues, which basically use large language models everywhere in the Vygotskian Autotelic agents as the goal sampler, as the policy, and as the performance evaluation. Another perspective is to use large language models as the social feedback, so directly in the interactions with the world, or either in an internalized fashion, as I mentioned in the productive modules. And the last crazy idea before I stop, all the thing that I talked about today, and especially the research about cultural convention exploitation, relies on simulated social feedback. And this simulated social feedback is really extensive. We need a lot of language data to actually train our agents, and it's really simplified. And maybe there are opportunities to actually leverage more realistic social-cultural interactions. This is the objective of the Mind Dojo project, where the idea is to leverage internet-scale knowledge coupled with Minecraft interactions to actually train agents in Minecraft. And I believe that in general, the data that we are collecting every day on Twitch could be actually leveraged, because what's basically on Twitch is video game players that are constantly explaining and providing linguistic descriptions of the behaviors that they are carrying out in these video games. So I think this data set could be really powerful for Vygotskian agents. So with that, I'm done with this presentation, and I want to thank, of course, my amazing supervisor with whom I worked for the last 3.5 years, all my amazing co-authors without whom I couldn't have conducted this amazing project. I had a lot of fun in doing that. And of course, my jury member who agreed to review my work and agreed to be here today. And thank you very much.